Hello YouTube and welcome back to another Dare to Game video. Today we are talking about Elden Ring, and it's finally time for our conclusive review. I've played the game for well over 250 hours, and I believe I've experienced everything the game has to offer. And I'm ready to lay out my thoughts right here and now. I will do my absolute best to avoid spoiling the story at all, so feel free to watch this review even if you are yet to start the game. Like all my reviews, I will focus on 5 key areas. These areas are graphics, gameplay, story, length, and replayability. As is the nature with reviews, these are my opinions based on my considerable experience with this game specifically and gaming in general, but many of which are still subjective and should therefore be considered as such. But let's just dive on in and get to it. To be clear, this is not my first FromSoft Souls-like game. I've played Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3, I played Bloodborne, and I even played Demon's Souls. I skipped Sekiro Shadows Die twice because I'm not a weeb, but I jumped back in with Elden Ring on launch. All this is to say my experience is flavored by the fact that I am very used to FromSoftware's style and the experience these games offer. Prior to Elden Ring, I would say that Dark Souls 2 was my favorite FromSoft game, but now it's safe to say that Elden Ring has taken that spot. It is arguably the best of them all, and does pretty much everything better than any of the other games, and brings all of the good aspects of each together. With all this in mind, Elden Ring is not my favorite game. In fact, gun to my head, I would struggle to place Elden Ring in my top 15 games of all time. It's okay. If you like Souls games, you will likely enjoy this game, perhaps even love it. If you've never played a FromSoft game before, this is a good first one, because as I already said, it's the best of the batch. So as a short TLDR, it's a solid game that I think is a solid play for nearly anyone who enjoys open world gaming, and I recommend it. However, it is certainly not the greatest game of all time. Now this game has gotten a lot of praise over the last few months, and much of it is well deserved, but it's important to remember that many of the comparisons it has received to other games are just ridiculous. On my channel, knowing that I would someday review this game after I had decided I was finished with it, I ran a series of polls that received thousands and sometimes even tens of thousands of votes, and these polls were all specifically designed to highlight recency bias in favor of Elden Ring, as well as to demonstrate some hardcore fanboying. I did all of this because despite enjoying the game myself, I still consider it to be a pretty average experience. However, I have seen tens of thousands of posts and comments online professing Elden Ring to be the single greatest game of all time, and comparing its various elements favorably to other GOAT games, consistently. As someone who has played most of the GOATs, I found this pretty laughable, and wanted to address it. So let's start with graphics. Elden Ring is a good-looking game. It came out in 2022, and it doesn't look bad by 2022 standards. It's not like a Bethesda game in that it didn't immediately look outdated by several years on release. However, the overall graphical fidelity of the game is actually pretty low. Sure, this is probably more noticeable to me as someone who spends a lot of time isolating images in the world, but it is still noticeable to the objective eye. The game is highly stylized, and that works to its favor. It is nowhere near photorealistic, but it doesn't appear that this was the goal. It's a fantasy game set in a pseudo-afterlife world with all sorts of crazy stuff going on, so the artistry of the world works in my opinion. I would say that there are some beautiful views in this game, with nearly every region of the map having some incredible vistas that really hold up to scrutiny. That is a strength of this game. However, the closer you get, the less impressive the graphics of this game are, particularly when talking about character models, buildings, and plants. When you get a real close look at any of these, you'll notice that they're pretty blurry or even pixelated, depending on how much you're trying to isolate the image. So overall, I would give Elden Ring a 6 out of 10 for graphics. However, when I asked this question and compared Elden Ring to Red Dead 2, Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and The Witcher 3, and also Kingdom Come Deliverance, 4 games which are widely considered to have some of the best graphics for any game ever, Elden Ring won with 52% on a poll that had over 21,000 votes. Surely a case of recency bias, or a group of gamers that only plays Souls-like games. As far as gameplay is concerned, I mainly focused in on combat, as that is pretty much what FromSoft games are all about. Outside of combat, we have things like interactions, animations, world traversal, and discovery. And to be fair, in all of these areas, I think Elden Ring excels. World traversal is handled quite well, despite being a large world divided into closed-off sections based on story progression or discovery. You can get around pretty well. The story and discovery mechanics encourage you not to fast travel, as it makes it way more likely that you're going to miss stuff. But there are a lot of fast travel points that make quick movement convenient once you've already been there. And Torrent, the spectral steed which you get near the beginning of the game, makes regular travel considerably faster and more painless than it would have been on foot. I also find most of the animations to be pretty smooth and not at all jarring, and I enjoy the way dialogue happens in the game, feeling far more natural than many games' cumbersome menu systems. I also love the discovery system, being a combination of random drops based on literally whether or not the enemy is equipped with that weapon or armor, and then of course set locations. I hate games where everything is random drops, as it is super immersion breaking, and I feel it's a clear sign of lazy game devs who want to pad out a game with fake content. The combat in the game is another matter, and to quickly address the elephant in the room when discussing a FromSoft title, no, it's not too hard. And no, it should not be easier. In fact, I would say Elden Ring is the easiest game that they've ever made, excluding Melania, of course, who is just the worst. The thing about difficulty in Souls games is that I would say 90% of the content offered by a game like Dark Souls or Elden Ring is the boss fights. Everything else, story, exploration, lore, and fashion, fills the other 10%. If they made the boss fights easier, they would just be chopping a 40 to 60 hour game down into a 10 to 15 hour game. So no, I wouldn't change anything about the combat and boss fight difficulty. That being said, it is certainly not perfect. The game has stereotypical fantasy video game style combat, which I hate. Very few of the weapons act like they would in real life, or should in anything resembling reality. All the animations make the weapons look at least 10 times as heavy and unwieldy as they should, except the giant, impossibly large weapons, which shouldn't be movable, and yet handle remarkably similar to the smaller, more realistic ones. And this game also is typical for FromSoft titles in that it has my least favorite way to make fights difficult. Most of the bosses break all the rules. They're huge, fast, super maneuverable, damage sponges that can one-shot you from the right angle. I've always believed this was lazy. As a writer, if I made a character massive yet fast, and impenetrable yet insanely maneuverable, I would be accused of writing a Mary Sue. Yet when FromSoft does it, everyone claps like trained seals. For combat, and therefore gameplay, I give Elden Ring a 5 out of 10. My first poll regarding combat was about accuracy, meaning which game does the best job of making combat seem realistic. As in, do weapons act like they should? Do people or creatures react the way they should when they are hit, etc. And of course, the standard here is real life, applying the laws of physics as we know them to be. Obviously, I understand that the game is fantasy, but the magic MacGuffin doesn't excuse things that don't need to be that way. I compared it to Kingdom Come Deliverance, a game with hyper-realistic medieval combat and armor systems, Mountain Blade, a game with directional combat and despite lacking weight provides pretty responsive combat, The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt, which is also a fantasy game that relies on magic, yet doesn't use it as a crutch and shows weapons acting in a pretty consistent way with reality, and Hellish Quart, arguably the most accurate dueling game ever created. Unsurprisingly, 66% of poll participants voted for Elden Ring, showing yet again that either they had never played the other games, or that they were going to fanboy as hard as possible for Elden Ring. My second poll regarding combat was about how fun it was to do. This time I compared it to Kingdom Come Deliverance, The Witcher 3, God of War, and Middle-earth Shadow of War. Now, despite the fact that I enjoy the combat of all 5 of these games, this is not a comparison. For me, the combat in Middle-earth Shadow of War dominates all the rest by a wide margin. It can be incredibly challenging because enemies can be totally immune to many of the ways that you can choose to engage in combat. But it just has so many options that if your skill level is high enough, you can feel like an unstoppable god on the battlefield. It's smooth, fluid, the attacks have weight, special attacks feel earned, and combos exist and actually mean something. The 2018 God of War is far more limited and scripted, but still the combat feels weighty, immersive, impactful, and the weapons you use feel important. Kingdom Come Deliverance seamlessly blends hyper-realistic combat against actual armor with a video game formula that aims to prevent realism fatigue to result in a balanced combat system that I feel it achieves in spades. And again, even The Witcher 3, which is also a magical fantasy game with huge boss fights, keeps its combat from feeling painful and sluggish. Yet despite this, Elden Ring yet again wins the poll with 71% of the vote. Like I said, I don't hate Elden Ring's combat, and found many ways to make it pretty enjoyable, but it's hard to justify that margin if the participants are even pretending to be objective in any way. The story of Elden Ring is, in my opinion, its weakest point. This should not be surprising because that is very typical for FromSoft's games. It is not a story-driven game, at least not in a conventional narrative sense, so this should be common sense. If you play the game in anything less than a scouring fashion where you read every item description, carefully listen to every line of missable dialogue from every single NPC you encounter, and study each of the cutscenes like you're being graded on it, you are just going to miss most of what is going on. To be clear, I played very casually on my first playthrough to see how much of the story I caught just by doing what made sense. I didn't use any guides, I didn't watch any YouTube videos, nothing. I isolated myself and just played the game. My first playthrough was right around 60 hours, with an above average level of exploration, but in the end, I was left with a very vague idea of what was going on. The Elden Ring is a thing that got broken, and you're a person who wants it for some reason, and a bunch of magical mutant looking bad guys have pieces of it, and that's about it. If that doesn't sound crazy compelling, imagine my shock when I watched Vadavidya's lore videos and realized how much I missed. The lore of the game is actually super detailed and really interesting. They just don't tell you about it. And before everyone starts ranting about game design and that's what all the games are like, yeah, I know they want the story to require detail-oriented investigation. I think that's a bad way to tell a story. Just to put it into more common terms, if I offer to tell you a story about my childhood, and then I give you some rough details about how I got a book and it was important until I lost it, and then stopped, you would probably ask what the story was, or why even tell it. I then say, well, if you read my childhood diary and go ask every single one of my relatives about the event, and then piece together all of their stories, and also dive to the bottom of a lake and grope around in the dark mud for the cover of the book that's still sitting there, then you'll have most of the story. For one thing, most people would not go through the effort, and if you did, it would likely seem like it wasn't worth it. This is a fine way to tell a story if you don't want to tell a story. For me, however, it will never not seem lazy, and so it's just bad. So as far as story is concerned, I give Elden Ring a 2 out of 10. The poll I did regarding story for Elden Ring was clearly a trap, and even though it only got 13,000 votes, showing the fact that many fanboys probably knew it wasn't a realistic swing, Elden Ring took second place, beating out 3 games that I would say have far better stories. It lost to Red Dead Redemption 2 because the story of that game is one of the best stories ever told. Not just video games, it was legendary, and so obviously it had to win. But I would say that Kingdom Come Deliverance, The Witcher 3, and even Skyrim all have stories that are leaps and bounds ahead of Elden Ring. At the end of The Witcher 3, if you actually played it with an intent to pay attention to the story, you should feel invested in many different aspects, including character motives, world events, and even in-world history. Kingdom Come Deliverance tells a pretty historically authentic story, with characters that are for the most part pretty real feeling, and plot lines that actually make sense, and even a plot twist that many people didn't expect. Even Skyrim, which feels pretty bland being over a decade old and played 100 times, still leaves you with a pretty clear idea of what happened, and what some of the motivations were, and who the people involved were. Elden Ring is not a story-centric game, because it does not tell a story. It doesn't matter if a story exists, and even if it's great. If you have to watch Vadavidya's video to enjoy the story, then he did his job, but FromSoftware did not. As far as length is concerned, like all FromSoft games, you can spend as much or as little time as you want completing it. I would say on average a playthrough is worth around 50 hours of gameplay, unless you are really bad at the combat in the game. But I would guess that there are many people out there who spent 20 or less hours playing it, many of which probably completed it, and they'll probably never pick it up again. For me, as I already said, I played it for over 250 hours. This is multiple full playthroughs, experimentation, and video making. However, a lot of it is pure gameplay, so honestly I would say if you enjoy the game and feel like playing it more than once, it is a 60+ hour experience, and that makes it less than $1 an hour for entertainment, which is a fair value and above average in the gaming world. So for length, Elden Ring gets a solid 7.5 out of 10 for me. When it comes to replayability, we are venturing into the purely subjective. I played it 4 times all the way through, and I experimented with a lot of different builds and explored every nook and cranny I could find. I would say at 250 hours, I am pretty fatigued with the game, and I will likely not play it again for at least a year, if ever. So at this point, its replayability is about 0% for me, but I played it 4 times, so I'm likely already above average in the field. The lack of a visible story might actually help it here, as it makes the game about combat and not about narrative. So maybe people get sick of it slower, but I would say it has very serious and real limitations to its replayability. If I'm being honest, I would have to say 5 out of 10 for replayability. I played it multiple times and got enjoyment from each playthrough, albeit to varying degrees. But like I said, I'm pretty much done with it, and a huge DLC might not even bring me back. In my poll, I compared it to Mountain Blade Warband, a literal sandbox with thousands of hours of gameplay potential, largely driven from total conversion mods, The Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, a huge open-world RPG with hundreds of hours of content and tens of thousands of great mods to try out, Fallout New Vegas, widely considered to be one of the best and most replayable RPGs of the last 20 years, and The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt, which I have personally played at least a dozen times, and which received 2 of the best story DLCs I've ever experienced, the second of which was actually larger than many standalone games. In this poll, Elden Ring, which had only been out for about a month at the time, won with a whopping 66%. Incredible legs for a game that shed 90% of its concurrent players within 2 months of being out. So with all of this being said, my final score for Elden Ring is 5.1 out of 10, which sounds about right considering I don't believe a 10 out of 10 exists, and a 9 out of 10 is about as rare as an objective fanboy. I would consider Kingdom Come, Red Dead Redemption 2, and The Witcher 3 all to be an 8 out of 10, Fallout New Vegas, Skyrim, and God of War are examples of a 7 out of 10, and base game Mountain Blade, Middle-earth Shadow of War, and The Last of Us are all solid 6 out of 10s. But that's about all I have to say about Elden Ring. Now I'll just leave you with a few of the polls that I didn't discuss in this video, for you to enjoy while coming up with your genius rebuttal to each of my points. In any case, thanks for watching, especially if you made it all the way to the end, and have a nice day. And I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching another Dare to Game video. If you liked this video, please leave a like and a comment. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. If you like my content and would like to support this channel, consider becoming a member today for as little as $1.99 a month. It makes a huge difference. But in any case, thanks for watching and have a nice day. I'll see you next time.